Welcome back, explorers, to Whoosh Tales, the home of the greatest kids' adventure stories anywhere on the internet, bringing you a brand new English story for children every single week. This is episode 19, and if you have been with Finn Walker since the very first night the sky cracked open over Stonehaven Village, you know that every single adventure so far has come to this family in one of two ways. Either the compass pointed the way, quietly and privately, toward a place only the family knew to look for, or someone the family already loved, Priya in Kalimpong, whose letter somehow found its way to exactly the right address, reached out directly because something inside them simply knew where to send their request. Today's story is different from both of those. Today, for the very first time, word of the Walker family's quiet, extraordinary work has traveled somewhere on its own, through ordinary human channels, from person to person to person, until it landed on the desk of someone none of them has ever met, in a small harbor on the coast of Wales, and she has decided to take the enormous chance of writing to a family she has never heard of directly, to ask if the story she has been told might possibly, impossibly be true. The morning it happened began like any other morning that summer had settled into. Their mother was making breakfast. Margaret was at the kitchen table with her large notebook, cross-referencing something in the journal against a small stack of maps. Nora was updating her beautifully organized chart, which now had a second neat check mark beside a second entry. Finn and Caleb had spent the previous weekend on a quiet, successful visit to a chamber beneath an old Welsh hill fort, the second of the 17 priority locations, a visit that had gone smoothly and had not required any particular drama, which the family had all quietly agreed was a very welcome change of pace after London. Old Thomas had not yet arrived for the morning session. Caleb was on the back step watching a family of wrens that had built a nest under the eaves of the barn. Finn was setting the table. The post arrived at its usual time, carried up the lane by the same postman who had carried the extinct bird's letter and Priya's careful blue-inked envelope, and more recently, an increasing quantity of ordinary post addressed to Margaret Halloran now that she had settled into the cottage's attic bedroom. Their mother sorted through the small stack at the table the way she always did. She paused at one particular envelope. It was a plain white envelope, slightly larger than most, with a Welsh stamp and a postmark from a small coastal town Finn had never heard of. The handwriting on the front was careful adult handwriting, neat and a little formal, clearly written by someone who had thought carefully about exactly how to address it. It said, "To the family in Scotland who help with difficult things. Stonehaven Village, the Highlands, Scotland." Their mother held it for a long moment. "Well," she said quietly, "that is a new kind of address." She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of good quality writing paper, covered on both sides in the same careful handwriting. She read it silently first, her eyebrows drawing together slightly partway through in the particular way they did when she was working out how seriously to take something. Then she looked up at the table and said, "I think you had all better hear this." She read the letter aloud. "Dear family, I do apologize for writing to an address I am not entirely certain is correct, and for the strangeness of what I am about to ask, but I have run out of ordinary explanations, and a friend of mine insisted that this letter was worth sending regardless of how unlikely it might seem. My name is Bronwyn Price, and I run the Harbour office in a small fishing town on the coast of Pembrokeshire in Wales. For the last 6 months, every single boat that sails past a particular rock formation just outside our harbor mouth, a rock we call the Sleeping Giant because of its shape, loses all engine power completely for exactly 4 minutes every single time, and then starts again perfectly normally as if nothing had happened. This has happened to every kind of boat. Small fishing boats, the car ferry, even the Coast Guard vessel. Every mechanic in 3 counties has examined every engine involved and found absolutely nothing wrong with any of them. It happens at the exact same spot each time, and it lasts the exact same 4 minutes each time, which our harbor master, who has kept very careful records, insists cannot possibly be a coincidence. I heard about your family through a rather roundabout story. A Norwegian sailor told a story to a Cornish fisherman who works our summer season here about a family in the Scottish Highlands who quietly help with things that cannot be explained, and the Cornish fisherman told my own father, who has been very worried about the harbor, and my father asked me to try writing to you, on the small chance that the story might be true and that you might be willing to help. I do not know what I am asking you to do exactly. I only know that our small fishing community depends entirely on that harbor being safe, and that something is happening there that none of us can understand, and that we are, quite honestly, running out of ideas. If this letter has reached the wrong family, I apologize for the intrusion, and I wish you a very pleasant day regardless. If it has reached the right one, we would be more grateful than I can properly express. With sincere hope, Bronwyn Price. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment after their mother finished reading. Margaret set down her pencil very carefully. Old Thomas, who had arrived partway through the reading and had been standing quietly in the doorway with his tin of shortbread, came slowly into the room and sat down at the table without being asked. "Well," he said finally, "that did not take very long." "What do you mean?" said Nora. Old Thomas looked around at all of them. "I mean," he said, "that your grandfather always believed this day would come. He worked very hard all his life to keep the family's true work private and quiet, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because a family doing this kind of work needs the protection of privacy to do it properly, without interference, without pressure, without the wrong kind of attention. But he also always said that eventually, no matter how carefully you guard something, if you do genuinely good work in the world for long enough, word travels. Quietly, slowly, through the kind of channels that cannot be predicted or controlled. A sailor telling a story to another sailor on a long night watch. A story passed down a chain of ordinary people who simply found it remarkable enough to remember and repeat. He looked at the letter still in their mother's hands. This is exactly the kind of thing he meant. Somebody, somewhere, told a true story about your family without fully understanding it themselves, and that story traveled and traveled until it landed on the right desk. Margaret was nodding slowly. "This is actually a very important moment," she said carefully. "Not because of the Harbour problem itself, which sounds solvable, but because of what it represents. Up until now, every piece of work Caleb has done has been either entirely private, known only to the family, or requested directly by someone whose need reached him in an extraordinary way, like Priya's letter. This is the first time someone has heard a rumor, an ordinary human rumor, about the family's work, and has taken the considerable risk of writing to a complete stranger on the strength of that rumor alone." She looked at Caleb. "How this is handled matters, not just for this harbor, for everything that comes after it too." Caleb had been quiet through all of this, listening carefully the way he listened to everything important. He looked at his mother. "May I see the letter?" he asked. She passed it to him. He read it slowly, twice, his eyes moving carefully over each line. When he finished, he set it down gently on the table and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This does not sound like one of the 17 chambers." Old Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance. "No," Margaret agreed. "It does not. The 17 chambers all involve a creature that is failing or fading, calling faintly for help. This sounds like something different, something that is happening consistently and predictably rather than fading. For minutes at the exact same spot, every single time. That is not the pattern of a tired ancient creature slowly losing its voice. That is the pattern of something else entirely, something with a specific and deliberate rhythm." Old Thomas stroked his beard thoughtfully. "There are things in the old traditions," he said slowly, "that are not related to the old one's work directly. Creatures and presences that exist for their own reasons, following their own old patterns, that occasionally intersect with human activity in ways that seem mysterious to us, but make perfect sense from their own point of view." He looked at Caleb. "This might not be work for your particular gift at all. It might be something else, something we will need to actually go and see before any of us can properly understand what we are looking at." Their mother folded the letter carefully and looked around the table. "Well," she said, "whatever it is, that woman wrote a very honest, very careful, very brave letter to a family she had no real reason to believe existed, because her community needed help, and she was willing to take the risk of looking a little foolish in order to ask for it properly." She looked at Finn and Caleb. "That kind of courage deserves a response. I think you should go." They wrote back to Bronwyn Price that same afternoon. Their mother composed the letter carefully, at the kitchen table, with input from everybody, confirming gently and without excessive explanation that the letter had indeed reached the right family, and that 2 representatives would arrive within the week to see what could be done. Margaret suggested, and everyone agreed, that this first contact with someone entirely outside the family's existing circle should be handled with particular care. Finn and Caleb would go, accompanied by Nora for her calm, good judgment. but Margaret and Old Thomas would stay behind this time, partly to manage the ongoing work of the map, and partly because Margaret felt, with her usual careful wisdom, that the family's reputation would be better served by the children handling this themselves. With only Ember for company, the way their grandfather had always quietly preferred the family's very earliest work to unfold. Young, direct, uncomplicated by too many adults standing behind them. They flew to Wales 5 days later, on a bright breezy morning with high scudding clouds and a good following wind that Ember seemed to particularly enjoy, tucking her wings in slightly and letting the air currents carry her more than she usually allowed herself to. The flight down the length of Britain took most of the morning, and by early afternoon the coast of Pembrokeshire opened up beneath them. A spectacular ragged coastline of dark cliffs and small sandy coves and offshore rock formations rising dramatically out of a deep blue-green sea, with small fishing villages tucked into every sheltered inlet along the way. Caleb, watching the coastline unfold below them, said quietly to Finn, "This is a very beautiful country." "Yes," Finn agreed. "It really is." The harbor Bronwyn had described was easy enough to find from the description in her letter. A small horseshoe-shaped inlet protected by 2 long stone breakwaters, a cluster of brightly painted fishermen's cottages climbing the hill behind it, and, unmistakably, just outside the harbor mouth, a large dark rock formation rising out of the sea that did indeed, from the air, bear a striking resemblance to a giant sleeping on his side, one great shoulder and the curve of a great back visible. Above the waterline, the whole formation slick and dark and covered in seaweed at its base where the tide moved constantly around it. Ember set them down in a small quiet field just above the village, out of sight of the harbor itself, and the 3 children walked down the winding lane into the village with the salt wind on their faces and the cry of gulls overhead and the particular busy, purposeful atmosphere of a small working fishing harbor going about its afternoon business around them. They found the harbor office easily. A small whitewashed stone building right on the quayside with a hand-painted sign and a window full of tide tables and fishing regulations. The woman who came to the door when Finn knocked was perhaps 40, with wind-blown dark hair escaping from a loose bun and the weathered, capable, no-nonsense face of someone who had spent her whole life around a working harbor. She looked at the 3 children on her doorstep, 2 identical boys and an older girl, none of them looking anything like what she might have expected from the mysterious family in her letter. And her face went through several rapid expressions in quick succession, landing finally on a kind of cautious, hopeful bewilderment. "You're not what I expected," she said, honestly, which made Nora laugh, a warm, genuine laugh that seemed to put Bronwyn immediately at ease. "I am so sorry," Bronwyn added quickly. "That was terribly rude of me. Please, come in, I've got the kettle on." They sat in the small, warm harbor office, which smelled of salt and old rope and strong tea, and Bronwyn told them the whole story properly, in far more detail than her careful letter had allowed. The sleeping giant rock had been part of the harbor's landscape for as long as anyone could remember, entirely unremarkable, a navigation marker fishermen had used for generations without a second thought. And then, 6 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday in early winter, the harbor master's own boat had lost all power exactly as it passed the rock, drifted silently for precisely 4 minutes while he tried everything he knew to restart the engine, and then had simply started again as if nothing had happened at all. He had assumed it was a fluke. Then it had happened to the ferry the next week, then to 3 separate fishing boats in the same month. By spring it was happening to every single vessel that passed the rock, every single time, with a consistency that had gone from alarming to, in Bronwyn's careful words, almost eerily reliable. No mechanic could find anything wrong with any engine, ever. It always lasted exactly 4 minutes. It always happened at the exact same point in the water. And it had begun, everyone in the village quietly agreed without quite wanting to say it aloud, exactly 6 months ago, which was, Bronwyn mentioned almost as an afterthought, around the same time as an unusually severe winter storm had shifted a great deal of loose rock and sediment around the base of the sleeping giant. Caleb had been listening carefully throughout, his expression thoughtful and quiet in the way that meant he was turning something over in his mind. When Bronwyn finished, he asked gently, would it be possible to see the rock itself? Bronwyn looked slightly surprised by the request, but nodded readily. Of course, she said. I can take you out in the harbor launch, if you don't mind getting a bit of sea spray on you. We'll just need to be careful not to actually cross the spot where it happens, or we will be sitting still for 4 minutes ourselves." They went out in Bronwyn's small, sturdy harbor launch that afternoon, chugging slowly out through the calm water of the harbor and around the end of the eastern breakwater until the sleeping giant rose up ahead of them, larger and more strikingly shaped up close than it had appeared from the air. The great dark curve of stone genuinely did look remarkably like a sleeping figure, shoulders hunched, head tucked down, seaweed draping off it like a dark blanket, waves breaking rhythmically and endlessly against its base. Bronwyn cut the engine at a careful, safe distance and let the launch drift gently on the swell. Caleb sat very still at the bow of the boat, looking at the rock, his eyes moving slowly over its whole visible shape. After a long, quiet moment, he said, softly, so that only Finn and Nora could hear, "It is not calling for help." Finn looked at him. "What do you mean?" he asked. Caleb was quiet for another moment, still watching the rock. "I do not feel the same thing I felt with the creature under Graymore, or the one in the Arabian Sea, or the one under the London platform," he said slowly. "Those all felt like patient, tired waiting. This feels different. This feels like—" He paused, searching for the right word, like someone waking up, slowly, uncertainly, testing whether it is safe to be properly awake yet. He looked at Finn. "I do not think this is one of the 17. I think this is something the storm woke up by accident. Something that has probably been asleep in that rock for a very long time, long before any of the chambers on our map were even built. And I think it does not entirely know what it is doing yet. I think the 4 minutes might simply be it experimentally noticing that it can reach out and touch something the way a very young animal notices its own paws for the first time." Bronwyn, who had been listening to this exchange with wide, careful attention, said quietly, "Are you telling me that rock is alive?" Caleb turned to look at her properly. "I think so," he said gently. "I think it might have been alive, very slowly, in the way that very old, very patient things are alive for longer than your harbor has existed. And I think something about the storm woke a part of it up that used to be asleep. I do not think it means any harm. I think it might simply not understand yet how its own waking up is affecting the boats near it." Bronwyn absorbed this with the particular calm of someone who had already privately suspected something along these lines, and was almost relieved to have it confirmed by somebody who seemed to genuinely know what they were talking about. "What do we do?" she asked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the great dark shape of the rock rising and falling gently with the ripple of the tide around its base. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to go and sit with it for a while, the way I did with the plum tree in India and the creatures in the chambers. Not to heal it. I do not think it is sick or fading, the way the others were. I think it just needs company. I think it has woken up alone, after a very long sleep, in a world that has changed enormously since it last knew anything about it, and it does not yet understand what it is allowed to do or how to be part of things again without frightening everyone around it." He looked at Bronwyn. "Could you take us right up close to it, as close as you safely can?" And that, explorers, is precisely where we are going to leave this episode of Whoosh Tales. With a small, sturdy harbor launch drifting slowly toward the great dark shape of the sleeping giant in the golden afternoon light of the Pembrokeshire coast, and a pale 11-year-old boy about to do something no member of this family has ever quite attempted before. What happens when Caleb reaches the rock and what the sleeping giant turns out to actually be is a story too big and too important to rush through in the last few minutes of today's adventure. So we are going to follow it properly together next week. And the lesson at the heart of this particular kid's adventure story for explorers, even before we know how the harbor mystery resolves, is one worth sitting with carefully. Bronwyn Price wrote a letter to a family she had no proof existed, based on nothing more than a story that had traveled from a sailor to a fisherman to her own worried father, because her community needed help and she was brave enough to risk looking foolish in order to ask properly. That kind of courage, the courage to ask for help even when you are not certain anyone is listening, even when the request feels strange or unlikely or embarrassing, is one of the most underrated forms of bravery there is. So many problems in the world go unsolved not because no solution exists, but because nobody was brave enough to send the letter. If you are carrying a problem that feels too strange or too big or too embarrassing to ask anyone about, remember Bronwyn. Send the letter anyway. You may be surprised by who is listening, and by how far your quiet request might travel before it finds exactly the right person to answer it. Hey, explorers! If you climbed into that small harbor launch with Finn, Caleb, Nora, and Bronwyn today, and felt the sleeping giant rise up dark and mysterious out of the Welsh Sea ahead of you, give this video the biggest thumbs up it has ever received because you have absolutely earned every mysterious moment of it. Our comment question today is a wonderful one. If word ever got out that you could help people with something extraordinary the way it did for the Walker family today, how do you think you would want people to find you? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Every single response will be read with great interest. Subscribe to Whoosh Tales right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single adventure story for kids. Because next week Finn and Caleb arrive right at the sleeping giant itself and discover that the mystery near the rocks has nothing to do with the 17 chambers on the map at all. It is something entirely new, something older than the map, older than the old ones, older perhaps than anything the family has yet encountered. We will see you next week, explorers. Hush! That evening, back at the small harbor bed and breakfast Bronwyn had insisted on arranging for them at no cost whatsoever, Finn and Caleb sat together at the small window overlooking the darkening harbor, watching the fishing boats return one by one in the blue dusk, their lights coming on gently against the deepening sky. Nora was downstairs having a long, delighted conversation with Bronwyn's elderly mother about traditional Welsh cake recipes. Caleb was quiet, looking out at the dark shape of the sleeping giant just visible at the harbor mouth, its outline barely distinguishable now from the darkening sea and sky around it. "Do you think it is frightened?" Finn asked quietly. Caleb thought about this for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that it is lonely. I think it has been asleep for so long that it does not remember what it is like to be known by anyone. I think tomorrow we are going to have to teach it." Finn nodded slowly. He looked out at the dark rock one more time before Caleb drew the curtain gently closed, and somewhere out in the harbor, in the deep blue Welsh dusk, something very old and very patient continued its slow, uncertain process of waking up, one small experimental moment at a time, waiting without quite knowing it was waiting for the boy who was going to come and sit beside it in the morning.